Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. As you're filing into our Climate Reads event, welcome. Okay, it looks like we're ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joel Whitney from Brooklyn Public Library's BPL Presents, the Arts and Culture Presenting Department. And it pleases me to welcome you to this month's edition of Climate Reads. This is something that was conceived by a group called Writers Rebel New York City. And we're so pleased to co-present it as we do every month with them. And this month, as we did last, we're also co-presenting with Orion Magazine. You'll hear from their publisher, Amy Brady, in a moment. Sorry, executive director, I think that's better stated. We're going to be talking about a truly unique book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. The fact that there's so many of you shows how beloved this book is. Wall Kimmerer writes, "We are all bound by a covenant of reciprocity, plant breath for animal breath, winter and summer, predator and prey, grass and fire, night and day, living and dying. Water knows this, cloud knows this, soil and rocks know they are dancing in a continuous giveaway of making, unmaking, and making again the earth." Before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to let you know, if you're here for the first time, this is a monthly, year-long discussion of books. Every other month is nonfiction or fiction. And next month we're back with another book. We don't have our panelists yet, but we do have the date, and we'll drop that in the chat. It's about exactly a month from today, I think. I have to refresh my memory in a moment. Again, we're co-presenting with Writers Rebel and Orion Magazine, and I'll be back in a moment to welcome our host, Leah Stokes, and our other panelists. But for now, I just want to welcome Amy Brady, who's going to tell you a little bit more about Orion. Take it away, Amy.
Great. Thanks, Joel, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's such a pleasure to spend this evening with you all to discuss such an important and beautiful book. My name's Amy Brady, and I'm the executive director of Orion Magazine. If you're not familiar, Orion is a magazine that's dedicated to an environmental writing. We are about to celebrate our 40th anniversary. And in that time, we have published some of the finest writers working, including Kathleen Dean Moore, who will be a part of the conversation this evening. And of course, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who not just wrote for us, she also, back in our early days, also served as a board member. And so it's extra special to be a part of this event this evening. If you like Braiding Sweetgrass, and I'm sure you all did, because that's why you're here, then I just want to say that you will also love Orion Magazine. And so as a thank you for all of you being here today, I'm going to drop a link in the chat that will allow you to subscribe for 1 year to Orion at a 20% discount. I'm going to do that now, and I hope you all take advantage of it and continue to be a participant in the types of conversations that we are having this evening. Again, I just want to thank the Brooklyn Public Library, which is a cultural force in downtown Brooklyn, and of course, Writers Rebel, who have done such an incredible job of conceiving of this series and of many other projects that bring together writers who care deeply about our planet and our relationship to it. So thank you all again for being here, and enjoy the conversation tonight.
Thanks again, Amy. We are going to be hearing the thoughts of our moderator, Leah Stokes, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science with the Brennan School of Environmental Science and Management, the Environmental Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. We're also going to hear from Dr. Jessica Hernandez, a transnational indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest, where it's very, very hot. Kathleen Dean Moore is a philosopher and writer, also from the Pacific Northwest, for many years distinguished professor of environmental ethics, also at Oregon State University. We're going to put their very impressive bios in the chat. My colleague Binyam will do that. We'll also put ways that you can follow Orion, BPL Presents, and Writers Rebel. I also want to say that we are coming to you when we're at the Brooklyn Public Library from Lenapehoking, unceded territory of Lenape people. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Leah Stokes, who will take it away. And of course, we'll want to hear from you shortly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to everybody who decided to join us today. We're really lucky to be having this conversation with Jessica and Kathleen. Thanks to Joel for doing some quick bios on all of us. Suffice it to say, they're really smart people, and it'll be a great conversation. So thanks for coming. First, I want to also acknowledge that we're all meeting today, no matter where we are on Indigenous lands. And personally, I am in Santa Barbara, California, which is Chumash and Swinomish territory. And the Brooklyn Public Library, as was already said, is located on the lands of the Lenapehoking people. So as we see so beautifully in this book that we read for this event, or will read if we didn't read it yet, because that's okay too, Indigenous peoples are still here. So when we do Indigenous land acknowledgements, it's important to recognize that despite the genocide that these communities have endured at the hands of white settlers, they continue to persist and exist in our American society, as well as societies around the world. They have traditions that are valuable and which we can all be drawing on in modern day culture. And that's a really important lesson, I think, as well from this book. So I want to talk briefly about the book and then pose the first question to Kathleen and Jessica. I found this book last year, and it was interesting because I actually read this Guardian article, maybe after I'd already found the book, about how this is really a sleeper word of mouth hit. So you may not realize, but this book was first published in 2013. So it was not published yesterday, but it has sold over 500,000 copies, which, if you know anything about book publishing, is insane. That's a blockbuster right there. And a lot of that just happened through word of mouth over time. And I really love that story because I can't imagine that when Robin Wall Kimmerer was writing this, that she thought it would be this massive hit. And it's really beautiful that it landed on the New York Times bestseller list 7 years after being published last year in 2020. So I really feel that this is an example of ideas whose time has really come. And it's beautiful to see this book resonating with so many people. So the first thing I want to ask Kathleen and Jessica is to set the scene for how they came to this book, given that so many people have come to this book in so many different ways. Where were you mentally and physically when you read this book? I'll share my own story and then turn it over to perhaps Jessica first and then Kathleen. I read this book actually a bunch on audiobook, which was lovely, while I was hiking in the Sierra last year. I'm originally from Canada, but I've moved to the United States, clearly. And I was in the Sierra for the first time, hiking these beautiful lakes, the Ray Lakes, if you know them, and listening to this book as I, trundled up high elevation passes and felt pretty exhausted. And it was really lovely to be listening to her words and ideas in that kind of this epic natural space. Really helped me reflect in a positive and hopeful way about the relationships that we all have to plants and wild places. And I myself am also a very avid gardener. And I also found that a lot of the things she writes about, for example, with the Three Sisters chapter about agriculture and our relationship to plants and her own role as an ecologist really resonated with my own experience. So that's sort of where my mental and physical headspace was at when I came to the book. And I'd love to hear Jessica reflect on the same question.
Yeah, so thank you, Leah. I'm actually calling from Tuwamish and Coast Salish lands, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Sealth. So one of the things that I want to mention is that I read this book because as an Indigenous woman entering the environmental sciences field, oftentimes our voices, perspectives, and knowledge systems are not incorporated in the environmental sciences. And I think that this book does a well job in defining how Indigenous science can blend in with Western sciences to create more holistic conservation practices and more holistic restoration practices that are important for us to address and incorporate, especially as we continue to experience climate change impacts. So I would say I read this book in my first year of undergraduate college at the University of California, Berkeley. And I think that this book kind of motivated me to continue pursuing the environmental sciences. As we know, we don't have a lot of Indigenous peoples in the environmental sciences. And I think that being able to read this book gave me a sense of belonging. It also kind of helped me understand that our knowledge systems as Indigenous peoples, while they might not be accredited through Western degrees, they're actually validated and they're valid and they're important. So I think that this book for me allowed me to build that sense of belonging, especially as an Indigenous woman entering the Western sciences, where we don't get to hear from Indigenous professors or listen to Indigenous perspectives when we think about the sciences as a whole. And I think now I can pass it to Kathleen.
Wow, that's really powerful, Jessica. Thank you for sharing that. You know, there are chapters in the book where she talks enormously about those exact issues as an ecologist herself and an Indigenous woman, and that tension that she feels playing those, sort of having those two roles. And I really enjoyed the chapter where she wrote about her doctoral student doing work on sweetgrass harvesting and how her doctoral student had theories, and some of the committee members and the people in the department who came from a white Western background were very dismissive of the theories of her Indigenous grad student and herself about the relationship between traditional harvesting and the plant and how they're kind of symbiotic in the human community and the plant community. So I really, yeah, to me, I have always understood the idea of Indigenous traditional knowledge, but I feel that Robin Wall Kimmerer brought it to life in a way that made it really understandable and accessible to, and really critiqued this Western scientific method, you know, very well. Kathleen, what about you? Why don't you tell us sort of your headspace and approach to this book?
Sure. I'm calling in from a community center in a small town on Chichagof Island, which is Tlingit land, and up here in Southeast Alaska. I have a little cabin outside of this town, up on a little hill above the water where two creeks and a bear trail meet at Tidal Cove in front of an island. And as it turned out, Robin came to visit and told me that she was bringing a new book, which was extraordinarily exciting. So my first acquaintance with the book was through Robin's telling of the stories in the book. And we had launched a two-person kayak, and we were paddling along behind the island. And she was in the bow and I was in the stern, and everyone knows that the person in the stern is supposed to be the one who steers, right? And so Robin was talking about how, well, the arguments about reciprocity she was going to make and about the animacy of plants and islands and so forth. And it was so exciting and thrilling to me. And she said she was really struggling with the title. She needed a title that really spoke of the three strands. She said this, I need a title that really speaks to the three strands that I'm trying to bring together in this book. And of course, as soon as she said three strands, she knew what her title was. She said, this book is called Braiding Sweetgrass. And the title was so perfect. And the place where she thought of it was so perfect that I completely forgot to steer, and I ran us right up onto a reef. And so here we are, stuck in this kayak up on a reef, just exulting in this book that she was preparing.
Well, I love this. This turned out to be quite a banger of a question I had here. Both you and Jessica have amazing answers to my question. Just hiking in the Sierra sounds like nothing compared to the you two. I love it. It's like launched Jessica on a career. Kathleen was there at the start. I love it. This is beautiful. It's such a gift-filled book. And that's, as Kathleen was just talking about, the next thing I want to raise. So a really big theme in this book is about reciprocity, relationships, gifts, right? she talks a lot about how plants have gifts, water has a gift, the land has gifts, and it is a gift. It's not something that can be owned. You know, that there are ways of knowing in sort of Western society that kind of say we own things and we extract from them, but that is not the way that she views the world, and that there are more traditional ways of thinking about things as gifts. And so she writes, for example, paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world, receiving the gifts with open eyes and open heart. And so, you know, this whole way of thinking, I think, really undoes some of our conditioning in Western culture, that it's about owning things, right? And accumulating wealth. And instead, she says it's a lot about thinking about what we can contribute to the land and how do we become reciprocal in relationship to place. And I'll tell you a story just in the last week or two that made me reflect on this, which is I live in Southern California. This is a place that has been experiencing historic droughts because of climate change. And the whole West actually is experiencing a drought right now, thanks to climate change. Believe it or not, almost 60 million people in this country are experiencing drought right now. But so one thing I do is I have an enormous amount of fruit trees. I have 34 fruit trees. I've planted a lot of trees. I'm really into that. And this year, what I noticed was when my first peaches came in, the sort of early variety, they all got eaten by the birds, like a lot. And I thought to myself, you know, I think that they need that fruit because it's a drought and there's water in this fruit. And this is like a gift. And I can say, oh, I'm in competition with those birds to get that fruit, or I can see this as a gift, that I'm in relationship with the earth and with an ecosystem, and that it's my job from a sort of interspecies solidarity perspective to supply and to support living beings. And I really feel that is something that this book turns our mind to, that it's not, you know, if you were a farmer, potentially you might have a bunch of ways to scare off the birds and not, you know, maximize what you get, so that you have the most and can sell it in a sort of capitalist way. But that she tells us that we need to turn to another way and never take too much, you know, never take more than a third, for example, is something that she writes about. So maybe Kathleen, I'll turn to you first. How do you reflect on on that big theme that runs throughout this book about the gifts that the natural world has, what kinds of gifts that we are called to give as well, and this reciprocal relationship that we're supposed to enter into?
I think that's a great question to start with, because I think it probably is the most transformative concept that Robin is offering to us. If I go to Walmart and I buy myself a pair of mittens, I don't think about where they came from. I don't think about honoring them in any way. They are my mittens because I bought them with my money and I can do with them what I want. If I run one down the dish disposal, you know, or the garbage disposal, it doesn't matter. It's a thing. But if my grandmother were to knit me a pair of mittens, and if in fact my grandmother had raised the sheep from which the wool came, which is in fact my grandmother does give me mittens, I would understand that that was a gift that had real value to me, that it was for me, that it was created out of love, and that it imposed on me a certain set of responsibilities. And the primary one, of course, is gratitude. Thank you for the gift of these mittens. I hold them, I wear them with pride. I understand the love in them. I understand what you've given me, which is a piece of yourself and your time. So I'm going to honor these mittens in a way that I don't honor the ones that I bought from the store. And how beautiful the analogy is. If I think that the earth is just a storehouse of natural resources to be extracted and sold, I don't feel any responsibility to that earth at all. I don't feel blessed by the earth. I feel greedy for what's being offered to me, not being offered me, what I'm taking, and I'm taking and I'm taking. But if I understand the beauty of the earth and the life-sustaining animals and plants of the earth, the miracle of plants that can make, or who can make, food out of air and sunlight, if I understand that as a gift to me, now my relationship is utterly changed. And my responsibility is to be grateful, to say thank you, to acknowledge the nature of the gift, to understand that it's not mine to take. I have no right to it. I have no claim to it if it could be given, if it were taken away. It's a gift. And so I am glad for it and grateful.
Beautiful. I love that. Jessica, what about you?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that Robin did a great job of highlighting some of the commonalities that we have as Indigenous peoples. In this case, land as a relative, right? Like we embody animals and plants as relatives as opposed to a commodity that the Western sciences instilled in us. And I think that attaching this economic value to natural resources is what's resulting in a lot of climate change impacts. And we look at who is being impacted the most by climate change, we know that it's Indigenous peoples, and that's because our interconnection, our relationship with the land and our natural resources is very in depth. That it defines our identity, in this case, our indigeneity. And I think that as a result, I can just think of what my grandmother used to tell me when I was little and raising me is that they came with their Bibles, we closed our eyes, and we ended up with their Bibles while they stole our land. And I think that that kind of embodies that, colonization still has impacts that it left on our lands, it left on our people. And I think by Robin bringing up the fact that land is not a commodity, it's something that we don't own, but it's a part of our identity, she's able to highlight how in order to build a reciprocal relationship, we need to kind of decolonize, right? The notion that we own things. And as we know, a lot of the lands, a lot of the monuments were named after settlers, after colonizers, after people who enacted genocide against our Indigenous communities, and those same people who stole our lands. And I think with her mentioning this, it kind of allows non-Indigenous peoples to realize that the relationships that we as Indigenous peoples have with our lands, like when we are out there in the front lines advocating for the protection of our lands and natural resources, we're not doing it for selfish reasons, we're doing it for the 7 generations. So thinking far ahead of how we can sustain and maintain our cultures for our future generations, because despite 500 years of colonization that we have endured, as you mentioned, Leah, when you did your land acknowledgement, we're still here and our resilience or resistance is amplified. But unfortunately, we do have the highest ecological debt, meaning that we are experiencing the most impacts of climate change. But when we talk about who is responsible, it's not us, but we're taking on that responsibility because it's our inherited right to protect our Mother Earth and our lands.
Yes, that's so true. I think of near the end of the book when she talks about Onondaga Lake, where she lives, and how destroyed it was by, in this case, extractive industries related to, like, I don't know, industrial processes, chloralkali stuff. Chloralkali production, and basically mercury and lime was dumped into this lake and it became extremely toxic. And she talks about how the Onondaga people and the Haudenosaunee people have been working to restore their lands, in part to restore the environment, right? That there's almost like this responsibility that some Indigenous communities deeply feel towards the restoration process, even though they have been dispossessed and they have not been allowed to steward their land. And this has been a huge insult and injury to the community. So the third question that I want to turn to is probably one that feels quite present, especially for you, Jessica, because I believe you're in the Pacific Northwest right now, which is the heat wave that's going on all across the continent. My younger sister lives in British Columbia, Canada, and they set a record of all time temperature for the entire country of Canada over the last few days. British Columbia is not historically a warm place, just to be clear. And, when we see these heat waves, I certainly was up very late on Sunday night worrying about what would happen in Seattle, what's happening in Portland, what's happening in Vancouver, all these places. And it's easy to feel despair about climate change and the ecological collapse that we are seeing. But Robin Wall Kimmerer very starkly warns us against this. And I think she is completely correct. She draws in part on the work of Joanna Macy, who's another writer that I deeply love. And she says that, I don't know if you remember in the early parts of the book, she tells a story of asking her students, hey, can you think of any positive relationship between people and the land, the planet, the earth. And she tells us that the majority of her students could not come up with anything. And she says that that is in part a reflection of the lack of Indigenous knowledge that has been integrated into the curriculum or into people's understanding, because if they had those kinds of ways of knowing, they would be able to come up with positive things, such as the historical cultivation of sweetgrass, for example. So she says that despair is paralysis. It robs us of agency. It blinds us to our own power and the power of the earth. Environmental despair is a poison. I love this. And she's very clear that the path is not to all freak out and get upset. She says, even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair. And actually, this whole book that's over my shoulder here called All We Can Save, which is a collection of women all across the climate movement writing about these things. The whole concept of the title of the book, All We Can Save, is the same kind of thinking. It's not, wow, we're all doomed and everything's terrible. It's, we can still do things. There are still things worth saving. And so one of the really big themes in the book is about restoration of land, restoration of relationship to land, right? And I really see how so many people are fighting for that vision right now. For example, yesterday, Sunrise Movement, 500 young people rallied in front of the White House to call for a civilian climate corps. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's an idea within the American Jobs Plan of creating, sort of like under the New Deal, a workforce of young people who would be doing things like land reclamation, mine reclamation, climate change adaptation projects all across the country. And that is a vision in line with Walt Kimmerer's visions of a positive relationship between people and earth. It's an antidote to despair. So I wonder if you can reflect, maybe Jessica first, on what you're seeing with climate change right now in your own backyards, and how and what that calls you to do. How do you maintain this joy and this action that Walt Kimmerer tells us that we need to be oriented towards, as opposed to the poison of despair?
Thank you. I think that when I like read and listen to what Robin mentioned, I think that one of the words that I can think of instead of restoration is healing, because I think that our landscapes need to be healed, especially because our interconnection and relationship as Indigenous peoples with our lands is so strong that when we heal our lands, we also heal ourselves. And I think that our land carries our trauma. So in this case, the trauma that the land has carried since colonization can be one of the reasons why we are also experiencing climate change impacts from an Indigenous lens. But Western sciences teaches us that, because of these environmental impacts, we are seeing an increase in temperatures. And I think that when I am experiencing this drought as we speak today, all I can think of is how it's impacting the salmon. And I think the salmon is an important keystone species, especially cultural keystone species for the Pacific Northwest, because the tribes in the Pacific Northwest who are referred to as Coast Salish peoples, and they have a lot of tribes. It ranges from southern Alaska all the way to the north of Oregon. This species is threatened, it's like in danger. And as we continue to see these climate change impacts, it's making them borderline extinct. And I think that when we lose certain animals that play an important role in certain Indigenous communities, part of that identity as Indigenous peoples is also lost. And I think that when Robin mentions restoration, I cannot not think of healing our landscapes. And I think that with that, as an Indigenous person, especially with my positionality as an Indigenous scientist, also, I see that as you mentioned also, Leah, we see this responsibility that we had to heal our landscapes. We have to heal our lands, our oceans, because if we don't do anything, if we, go into that despair, is going to kind of freeze us. It's not going to allow us to take action for what is needed. And I think that when we heal our landscapes and our oceans, we're also healing ourselves, because we do carry that trauma. As we have seen the recent news, for those who don't know, there's a lot of uncovering of Indigenous children's bodies that were buried by boarding schools. And that has unleash a lot of wounds that we are carrying, especially as intergenerational trauma plays a role in our lives as Indigenous peoples. And that's why I can also think of how restoration can allow us to heal us first and our lands, because we're so integrated with each other. We're kind of interconnected like roots when we talk about Indigenous peoples and land as well.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for raising the several tragic, I don't know the right term for it. There's different debates about it, burial grounds or mass graves. There's different people who think it should be referred to in different ways of Indigenous children in Canada related to the residential school system, which operated in Canada for a long time, as well as the United States. And if you're not familiar with it, involved taking people, actually Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about it in the book, so you would have learned a little bit about it, involves taking young children from their parents and divorcing them from their culture and their language critically, putting them in really toxic environments, creating cycles of really terrible trauma over multiple generations. And this has happened all across North America. And this is something that I know a lot of people in Canada right now, because of these mass graves, are paying a lot of attention to. Kathleen, I'll turn to you. What do you think about what Wall Kimmerer tells us about despair and hope, and how do you kind of hold those things yourself in your own work?
Yes, I've been reading about those killings and the children, and it's unspeakable. And it's not, we're talking about sexual abuse and emotional abuse and physical abuse. It's unthinkable. And so let me just make a couple points about grief and racism. I think it's important to distinguish, first of all, I'll make this point. I think it's important to distinguish between despair on the one hand and grief on the other. Grief, I think Robin would tell us, is our friend. And we need to welcome grief in. If it knocks on the door, let it in. Let it stroke your hair. Let it comfort you. Let it make you a cup of tea. Grief is a measure of our magnitude of our love. And the greater our grief is, the greater our love. So as we love our children, oh my God, the grief, to imagine what happened to them. As we love that, as she loved the Onondaga Lake, imagine the grief of seeing it transformed into a toxic waste dump. Grief is a way of saying there is meaning and value in this, and I have lost it. But despair, on the other hand, is really a deadly thing, because it says that there is no meaning in that. There is no love in that. I am not connected to it. It means nothing. And so despair is a horribly dangerous thing. If it knocks on your door, don't let it in. It denies the value of what you've lost. It denies the meaning in what you've lost. So Robin goes to some lengths to encourage us to embrace the sorrow and turn away the denial of meaning that comes with despair. So I think that's one important point to make, because we are all grieving. When I think about the heat wave, it's very, very hot up here in Alaska too. Unbelievable. And so the winds are very, very strong. When I think about the damage that that's doing to the forests, it's almost hard to hold in your heart. Let me make another point about grief that's related to anger, because it's very interesting to see how Robin is very reluctant to talk about anger. She'll talk about longing. She'll talking about grieving. She'll be talking about world-class mistakes, cosmic mistakes. But you won't find outrage there. Even though I would add my own opinion that there is room for an awful lot of outrage. And in particularly with the fossil fuel industry, that fracking requires racism. Fracking could not exist without dismissing people's interests. And I think that Ibram X. Kendi is absolutely right when he says, in order to frack, you have to lay waste the land. And in order to wreck the land, you have to move people off out of their land. In order to move people off their land and destroy their land, you have to destroy their lifeways. And you can't destroy their lifeways unless you have no regard for them. And you cannot you cannot have no regard for people without being guilty of racism too. So the very structure of the oil industry, the very structure of oil and gas is deeply imbued with colonialism and racism and the abuse of people. And so if a person were to feel angry, I think that would be a perfectly reasonable response. And I'm so pleased to see the Indigenous people standing up for the water that they believe in and for all these, it's so bravely
Yeah, one thing we
and
have
so
to talk about.
ethically.
Yeah,
All of the actions, yeah.
did not mean to cut you off, Kathleen.
No, it tells me that I probably was going on too long.
No, you were not going. It was beautiful. This is so great. I'm having a lot of fun. I don't know what the audience thinks, but I'm loving this. This is great. I work a lot in the trenches of climate policy at the federal level right now, and there's so many days. Today was probably one of them where I have a lot of anger. I have a lot of frustration. It's hard. And so this is a very healing, to use Jessica's word, conversation to be spending with you two brilliant ladies. So I'm very pleased with that. And I will say, you know, one thing we haven't talked about is the fight over Line 3 right now that's going on. There's going to be a protest in front of the White House about that tomorrow. And that's a really important Indigenous fight against the pipeline that's currently happening that you can support in many ways if you're interested in doing that. So the last question that I have before we turn it over to Q&A from all of you, so you should be chatting away in the chatter box because nobody's done it yet, I don't think. So you can put question in the chat box and then we will discuss it. But the last question that I get to ask, because I'm lucky, is about the idea of becoming Indigenous to a place. Thought this was a fascinating concept in her book. So if you recall, she talks about the Anishinaabe story of the first man, Nanabojo, and she talks about how initially he was like an immigrant to Turtle Island, right? He came, he didn't know anything, and he started walking around, and then he started to name plants and start to get to know the place. And she calls him the Anishinaabe Linnaeus, Linnaeus being the Western science figure who named a lot of things, right? Taxonomy and all that stuff. And she asks all of us as readers, regardless of if we are immigrants or Indigenous, if we can do this, if we can learn to be in relationship and knowing with our local environment, if we can become Indigenous to place. And she says, for all of us, becoming Indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it. And I really like how she invites the reader into that, regardless of our backgrounds. I think that's a very open way. It's different than sometimes how we see culture being discussed, that it's one person owns it or another person owns it. To me, this feels a very permeable kind of thing. And what I recently reflected on is, I don't know if people remembered that Rick Santorum gave a speech a couple months ago saying that when the Europeans came here, it was tabula rasa, blank slate. There was no culture. So here, that's why we brought our culture here. And a lot of Indigenous peoples got very upset about that. I did too, as a non-Indigenous person, because that's BS, as we would say, a technical term. There was culture in this place, and it was in many ways eradicated or attempted to be eradicated through genocide. And while Kimmerer says, no, there is culture here, and that culture can be drawn on and into the fabric of American culture in the modern day, right? That she's inviting us to not say that that's something that's owned over here or that's in a museum or something like that. She's saying, you can learn from this culture. You can bring it into your life. You can become Indigenous to a place. And so I wonder, maybe Kathleen, talking to you first, what did you think about this concept of becoming Indigenous to a place?
I have some hesitation about the way that is phrased. I don't know that I could ever become Indigenous to this place because my roots are in a very, are over in Europe. My family roots are in Europe. That's, and as are my philosophical roots. But I would be deeply, deeply honored if I could be instructed by people like Robin and other elders about a moral code that would allow us to live in a place without wrecking it. So I would be honored to be taught about gratitude. I'd be honored to be taught about greed. Some of the strongest parts of the book, I thought, were those that talked about how abhorrent accumulating wealth is in her culture and how shameful it is when a person takes more than they need and doesn't share. The importance of sharing and the importance of restraint and the importance of not taking more than you would use honorably. So important that if a person were greedy and showing off his riches, he would be first, she says, instructed, lovely, and then shunned, and then if that didn't work, banished. Can you imagine what the American culture would be like if people who accumulated wealth instead of sharing it were to be instructed, shunned, and then banished? It would be such a shameful thing to do, to take more than you need. That would be transformative. So as far as becoming indigenous to a place, I would love to be instructed in honoring it and living in a way that makes room for everybody else. And so I think that our people like with European heritage who have come as settlers to this land should approach the indigenous wisdom with a great deal of humility. And I confess a great deal of eagerness, almost desperation to learn.
Thank you, Kathleen. Really appreciated that reflection. You know, it's sort of like we raise up billionaires as if they are something to be achieved or something great in society. I certainly saw this a lot with Bill Gates. You know, he was like the good billionaire, and it's been fascinating to see how people reflect in the last few months with his divorce, that like, was he really a great person? Where did that narrative come from? And how we hold that up as sort of the highest achievement versus what we see in the book of saying that being extractive and greedy is a bad thing, and that, you know, culture shift could be huge in the way we see things here. Jessica, what about you? What did you think about this idea that she talks about?
So I also agree with Kathleen in terms of like, can people really become indigenous to a place that they're not native to? And I think that the way that I interpret this is that everybody has indigenous roots. Like if you have European ancestry, you have those indigenous roots, but because colonization, most people who have European roots have been taught to assimilate to this American culture, right? Which is whiteness, the whiteness in America. And when I read and hear about becoming indigenous to place, I actually think about it differently from my point of view. And I think that as a transnational indigenous woman, what that means is that my indigenous communities are separated by the border. So I'm also Mayan, Chorti Maya. And one of the things that I think of is how my people from Central America, indigenous Mayan peoples, are being forced to basically are being forcefully displaced from our lands because one, the United States and Canada backed a genocide against our indigenous peoples during the Central American Civil War. Two, so because our lands were sold through large corporations like Chiquita, like all these plantations, we no longer have access to our land. So we're facing a lot of extreme climate change impacts. And I think of how this displacement, once in the United States, is criminalized, right? We see how our children, indigenous children, kind of similar to what happened in the boarding schools, are being taken away from their families and placed in these detention centers. However, when we look at the media, when they portray immigration, they forget to mention that these children are indigenous. They forget to mention the Maya nations that they come from. And I think that as the United States, because we're failing to label indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples and climate refugees, we are forgetting to see how the United States continues to treat indigenous peoples from who are being displaced because of United States intervention, Canada intervention in these civil wars that took place in our lands. And I think that in order for us as displaced indigenous peoples, we're adapting our indigeneity to the new places because despite being dislocated, and we can also see that when we are displaced from our reservations into cities, our indigeneity adapts to our current environment. And I think that that's what comes to mind. And I wish that more people knew about what's going on in the border, especially how the border, most of the people who are coming from Central America, we focus on the nationality, right? Like they're Guatemalan, they're Salvadorian, they're Honduran, but we don't talk about how they're indigenous Maya and how are because of that language barrier, because they often think that we all speak Spanish when that's not the case. Spanish is also a colonial language. They, it has led to a lot of deaths of our children because they provide information in Spanish and not in our native languages. So I think what Robin mentions is like that, we're missing and we're being forced away from our languages and placed on these colonial structures of like, oh, if they're from Latin America, they must speak Spanish, when in reality, we do have indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. And we're seeing how this climate crisis is forcing indigenous people south of the border to migrate to the United States or Canada. And then once they hit this border, their immigration is criminalized. They're put in cages, they're put in detention centers. They have to go through this long process while the United States continues to blindly turn their sides and not kind of admit that, they had a United States intervention. And this civil war was coined as a genocide. It was classified as a genocide by the United Nations, but not a lot of people are aware of that information.
Thank you, Jessica. I have 3 things to reflect on with your really insightful comments. The first is, in Santa Barbara County where I live, we had a horrible fire in 2017, which then led to mudslides, and about 20-something people died in the community. Most of the people who died were lower income and people of color, even though it was in pretty much the richest zip code in the United States, Montecito. This is where Oprah and Harry and Meghan live. But even within that context, it was people of color and many immigrants dying. And one thing that was raised in the wake of that disaster response was that, you're right, the languages that were being used to communicate with people were Spanish and English, and not a lot of the indigenous languages of Mexico, Central and South America. And so I really appreciate you raising that. I think that's a really big issue that a lot of people don't understand. And I also want to echo again your point that the climate crisis is actually a huge driver of the immigration crisis. I put that one in air quotes, right? The border crisis. What we're doing, and somebody just asked, what does this have to do with climate change? Well, as Jessica has said, climate change is dispossessing indigenous peoples of their lands all around the world. And it's a huge issue when it comes to, for example, what's happening with the border. And we don't point to that, right? We don't understand the underlying drivers of Western cultures emitting enormous amounts of carbon dioxide over a century. There are companies lying about what was the cause behind it and how that's leading to these immigrations of people just trying to survive when their lands are not producing at the same level that they did before because of climate change. And the last thing I'll say is a brilliant point that Jessica made that I'd never thought of before, which is that the detention centers and cages that were established under the Trump administration can be thought of like a modern day residential school system. I have never thought of that before. Brilliant. That, when we talk about how indigenous children were taken away from their families in Canada and the United States and put into this residential school system. And when we think about how many of the people crossing the border are themselves indigenous, and their children are being separated from their parents, separated from their language and their culture, and put in cages for long periods of time and experiencing significant trauma, it is really parallel to the residential school tragedy. And it's happening right now. So really appreciate you making that brilliant, insightful point. So that is the end of my questions and comments. I have a very common question when we do climate events, maybe, I don't know if Indigenous events too fall in this category, Jessica, is, okay, for those of us who are not scientific focused or Indigenous or whatever the word is that applies, and are not yet involved in, let's say, climate advocacy or advocacy around Indigenous issues, what can we do to have an impact? So I'll turn it over to both of you, and then I'm happy to also add some ideas about what you can do to have an impact. Kathleen, how do you tend to approach this perennial question about what can you do?
It is perennial. People do ask me, they say, the problems are so big. What can one person do? And my answer always is, stop being one person. Ask yourself, what do what gifts, once this is Robin's question, she says, if you want to know what your responsibilities are, ask, what are my gifts? What am I able to speak? Am I able to write? Am I able to walk in a parade? Can I lick a stamp? You know, what am I good at? Can I do websites? Then what you're good at tells you what your role will be with others who share your passion. So what's my gift? What is my passion? And then where are the people who are equally impassioned, whom I can help with my gifts?
Very succinct and so true. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's a friend of mine and who was one of the editors of this book, a climate activist, she has those circles. It's like, what am I good at? What are my gifts? Where can I help? And that's how you fit in. So exactly, you're very much thinking the same way because it might be the right answer. Jessica, what about you? How do you respond to this question?
Yeah, I have something similar like Kathleen. I think that it's important for all of us to be open to learning and not just learning, but relearning and unlearning, right? Because sometimes we're taught a certain way and we think our perspective is the only valid way there is to live a life. For instance, like, like what does this book have to do with climate change? And I think it's good to be open to learning, hearing different perspectives, because like everybody's perspective is unique and it's embodied through our lived experiences. And I think that the more we interact with different people who are different from us, who have different identities, intersectionalities, which is important as well, we open ourselves to relearning the dominant narrative, right? Because we're taught this dominant narrative that continues to emphasize and focus on white men, white European men, right? In the sciences, we still praise white European men, but women have also, and LGBTQ communities have done a lot to contribute to the sciences, but they're often ignored, they're often silenced or eliminated from the discourses. So I think that deconstructing the way that we were taught from K through 12 all the way to higher academia, and also knowing that we all embody some type of science, whether that it's not validated through credentials, because we all know how to survive, how to live every day. We all know that we have to drink water every day so that we can survive. And I think that sometimes what we constitute as sciences is what we were taught the sciences. But I think that we all have inherited some type of science, but it doesn't necessarily have to be validated through a PhD. It doesn't have to be validated through like, oh, I got a bachelor's of science. And I think that once some indigenous scholars coin us decolonizer mindsets, we can start embracing that relearning and unlearning that we have to do no matter how young or old we are, right? Because I think throughout our lives, we have to be open to different discourses that are not necessarily dominant in our own lives.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I think that's very true. And I think this book was a great opportunity to do that, right? There was so much wisdom here of different ways of thinking and knowing in these various essays. My own answer is that much like what Kathleen was saying, joining an organization is a really important step. In this book, All We Can Save, I wrote a chapter basically answering this question, and I talked about circles. There's a Rilke quote, we live our lives in widening circles that reach out across the world. And the first circle is kind of like yourself. And a lot of people start there and some of them end there. Maybe some people don't even start there. And they're like, what can I do in my house or in my backyard or whatever? Like, oh, I should recycle more or get an electric vehicle or something like that. All very great. I support you. But the question is, how do you get beyond that? And the way to get beyond that is to join an organization. And the more we get involved in these issues, whether it's Indigenous rights issues, climate justice issues, et cetera, the more we see that they're structural issues and that they cannot be solved at the individual level. They have to be solved at the structural and societal level. And organizations become a pathway through which you can work at that broader level. So for example, myself, I'm very involved in an organization called Evergreen Action. It came out of Governor Inslee's run for president. And I work with that organization to try to shape climate policy at the federal level. And if I was just me, even with my knowledge and credentials and fancy stuff like that, I would be a lot harder for me to make the impact. But when I work with others, I can make a much bigger impact. So I would say look for organizations, and there's lots of things to do even in your local communities. So for example, right now, Santa Barbara County, where I live, Santa Barbara City is trying to ban fossil gas hookups in new buildings, very important policy, because every time we put in new fossil fuel infrastructure, we lock ourselves into warming. And I am involved in the local campaign here to try to get the city council to approve that. And there may be various campaigns in your own backyards on these issues that you can get plugged into. And the way to hear about them is through organization. So that's what I would say. Join an organization, get involved. That's really how you can make a difference. And if you don't even want to do that right now, we're trying to pass a climate bill, which is very important at the federal level. And you could just write to your member of Congress and your senator. Many of you may have Senator Schumer, an important senator, and tell him, Schumer, no climate, no deal. Climate change is the most important thing. So all of us can use our voices, and it does make a big difference. I study politics and how much letters actually go into offices in Congress, and not that many. So if you and your friends actually wrote a couple letters about this issue, believe it or not, that would be received, or gave a call, or whatever the question is. So politics is the tragic way that we must have to do this. So another question we have here from Susan is, it is quite possible to say that the most defining character of human nature is greed. This is something that Kathleen has reflected on in her comments here. How do you reconcile this with the more hopeful view that we find in this book from Robin about sharing? So Kathleen, do you want to reflect on that question from Susan?
The philosophers from about 300 years ago were very happy to convince us that we are essentially greedy, that we are essentially individual, that we are essentially in competition for a scarcity, terrible, tragic scarcity of goods. That is all baloney. But we have taken it into our hearts, and we've reimagined who we are. And my own view is that if we look around into our own experience, we'll discover that we are creatures who are born to care. And that our superpower, the superpower of the lion is his claws. The superpower of a human being is the ability to form cooperative communities. That's what has allowed us to survive this long and to grow in ways that we might regret. So I would quarrel with the question. I think that if you are going to be a capitalist overlord, you want people to think that people are greedy and selfish, that it's impossible for them to share, that a sharing economy is simply not the way human beings work. But I think those are convenient lies. So yeah, I think that we should be careful who tells us who we are. And if it conflicts with our own experience of who we are and what we love and what we really cherish, then I think we should recognize that it's propaganda, and it's propaganda from capitalist leaders.
Love it. Jessica,
sorry, that
Oh, sorry, Kathleen. I think we have a delay. I loved it. Jessica, what about you?
So I think I struggle with the notion of greediness, just because I feel like you can only be greedy if you have an abundance of resources. Oftentimes we see how, for instance, the notion of self-care can be seen as a greedy act, but in reality, it's important to also take care of ourselves, right? But I think that greed sometimes teaches us to meet our wants first instead of our needs, and also people's needs. For instance, during the heat wave, like, most of the people were concerned about getting AC systems, right? But we didn't, like, it was rarely addressed, even in the news, how it was going to impact the houseless folks, like people who don't have homes, people who live on the streets, people who don't have access even to drinking water during these time periods. And I think that it's important for us to keep a balance between greediness and also taking care of ourselves, because sometimes we can overdo it, right? Like, we can be like, oh, I need to go out there and help this. And I think that it kind of brings up the point that Leah mentioned, that sometimes we should stop thinking about individual impacts that we can have and join an organization, create a community where we can all work together to address those disparities that we want to help address. And I think that for those of us who have an abundance of resources, it's important to share them, especially with people who are marginalized, who don't have those resources. And, for instance, like, we may be concerned about our AC systems, but as long as we have one fan, I think that that's important to help us survive. But we have to think about like, oh, if I have an extra fan, can I drop it off of like a homeless shelter? What can I do to help people? And I think, what Leah mentioned, like joining an organization, doing that community advocacy as well, especially if you have an abundance of time, if your job allows you to be in the front lines, because oftentimes the people who are in the front lines end up losing their jobs because, we have like jobs that require us to be there. But like the higher you are in the scales of, your, what is it, like your role, you have that ability to join commissions, to join boards, to help kind of distribute those abundance of resources, knowledge, and time. Because I think time is sometimes something that we forget to see as a resource that some of us have an abundance of as well.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I really agree with that. And it's interesting because the government is actually meant to be a form of organization and cooperation amongst all of us. And what the government can be doing, for example, in moments like this, is setting up cooling centers, making sure that homeless people know where they are and getting them to them. And when we constantly have a culture in the United States that's anti-government, that's anti-social safety net, that's a way of turning against that cooperation and saying that, oh, it's all about me and my paycheck. I don't want to pay taxes because, so on and so forth. On the other hand, billionaires should definitely pay a lot more taxes. So partially, we don't have a very progressive taxation system to fund the government, which is a fundamental tool of cooperation. I really agree with what both of you said. This reminds me of the work of Rebecca Solnit. And if you've never read her work, it's awesome. Highly recommend it. She wrote a book, which actually I haven't read, even though I've read most of her books, but I know what it's about. A Paradise Built in Hell, where it's about all these tragedies that happen, like a heat wave sort of thing or a hurricane, and how, we might, the stories, if you were to watch TV, like zombie apocalypse, is that we'd all murder each other. But that isn't what happens. People actually to involve themselves in mutual aid, and communities look out for each other and they help each other during these tragic moments. And that really shows us, as Kathleen was saying, that we have a narrative of who we are as people, but that it is not true empirically. It's not true in the record. And that a lot of the narrative that we have comes from white Western men who, within a Darwinian framework, said that it was all about competition. And that idea is everywhere. It's in economics, it's in political science. It's like, let me tell you, that idea is everywhere. But it's interesting, and I think Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about this in the book, but there are some female feminist scientists and Robin Wall Kimmerer herself, who have done research to show that actually the systems of life are reciprocal, that they are symbiotic overwhelmingly, not competitive overwhelmingly. And we see this in things like lichens, right? Lichens are fundamentally a symbiotic organism, as well as in sweetgrass with human and plant environments. And so, yeah, I just think partially thinking about that narrative in our head and where it came from and sort of retraining our own minds, like Jessica was saying, is an important act. Like even myself, I can feel like, oh, I need to make more money so that I can afford to live. And let me tell you, California, very expensive place. And because of Prop 13, many people do not actually pay their fair share in taxes, and they've pushed it on to the next generation. So there are some structural issues here. But, thinking like from an abundance mindset, from a place of what can I give to others, and not from a competition. My worth is a measure of my paycheck, or I have to make as much money as possible, et cetera, in order to be worthy. So yeah, I think that that's a really brilliant reflection that Kathleen took us down the road on. That was a very good reflection. The last question that we will get to is one from Michelle. And she said that she loved the rules that Robin puts out for gathering plants. And we've talked a little bit about this, right? Ask, you're supposed to ask a tree before you cut it down, give back to the earth. Don't pick the first one you see or the last one you see, never pick more than half, and so on, right? This is something that's written about a lot. And I wonder, when you think about that, even metaphorically, it doesn't have to be literally you're going to gather mushrooms, although I do that and it's very fun. How can we carry that way of seeing and knowing into our daily lives? Jessica, why don't you provide a reflection on that, and then Kathleen, and then we will close.
I think this kind of connects to what I was taught by my elders when I was doing restoration work. So oftentimes we see invasive species or weeds as pests, but in reality, we also have to maintain that relationship with those plants because according to my elders and the teachings that were passed to me, there's still someone's displaced relatives. So like many of us are also displaced. Many people are displaced because, you know, we're not indigenous to this continent. In that case, we have to still pay respect to those invasive species, to those weeds. And oftentimes we forget as people when we're like attending to our gardens, we're like, oh, these weeds are like killing my plants and my flowers. But we forget to ask them also for permission, right? Because sometimes we as humans have defined what kind of plants we actually want in our ecosystems, but we forget that invasive species were displaced, they were introduced to this continent during colonization. So I often think of how we can sustain the same relationships that Robin mentions with plants to with both invasive and native species. And I think that what she mentioned, and I think it's a like I mentioned, she does a great job of like sharing some commonalities that indigenous cultures have throughout the Americas, is that we always ask for permission to harvest this plant because they have a spirit, right? They're a living thing. We leave medicine, whether it's be tobacco or any other plant that we have, when we take it away. I think that sometimes we have to ask people for permission, especially when we have certain conversations or discussions, like receive consent, right? Consent has become one of those topics that has increased in value in our generation, especially in present day. And I think that sometimes we even have to ask people for consent when we talk about, like, for instance, race, for those emotional topics. And I think that having that reciprocal relationship with plants, our environments, and people, because we're all a part of this ecosystem, will allow us to start building those reciprocal seeds that will plant, that will basically grow into plants of change, right? Because we're going to change how we view life. We're going to change how our relationships with land and people is manifested through what we're taught that is the dominant narrative. And I think that seeing what Robin mentioned and applying it into our lives will allow us to create a more harmonious life, because, you know, we still have racism in this country. We still have those racial injustices. And unfortunately, it's Black and Indigenous peoples impacted the most by racism because of colonization. So I think that it's all of our jobs to take a small action or a step to dismantle those systems, because when all of us collectively work towards dismantling the system, and like Leah mentioned, working as a collective, it will allow us to address those systematic barriers that we need to break down and get rid of.
Thank you, Jessica. Beautiful closing reflection. What about you, Kathleen?
Yes, I would thank Jessica as well. I thought that what you said was really important. And I think this is the most important question you've asked, Leah, because, and what I would say that the most important idea that Robin offers us is the notion of an honorable harvest. Oftentimes people, when they're told that people should consume less or take less and stop wrecking places, the response is this kind of heartless, well, what, should we all go back and live in caves? You know, which is outrageously insulting and outrageously limited in insight, because that's the challenge that we have, is to find a way to live on the planet without wrecking it. And more than that, the challenge that we have is to find a way to take what we need in such a way that we replenish the source. And, you know, Rachel Carson told us a long time ago that you can't destroy your habitat without destroying yourself. And of course, that's true. So the question becomes, how can you take what you need and leave enough with enough resilience that it can create more rather than just wipe it out? We cannot just take it till it's all gone. We have to recreate it as we're taking it. So I thank Robin for that insight. I think that's the challenge that we have to meet. It's not a reason not to think about the honorable harvest. It's a reason to think about it very, very hard.
Yes, and if you think about fossil fuel extraction, it's a very dishonorable harvest, isn't it? Because it is extracting a resource that causes permanent damage, really, for thousands, tens of thousands of years. and it is not an honorable harvest at all. So really appreciate you giving the title to the concept, Kathleen. That's correct. Really appreciate that. So Joel, I will hand it back to you to close us out for the evening.
Well, it's hard to see this wonderful conversation end. It was one of my favorites, if I'm allowed to say that, of the nearly year-long monthly discussions that we've been having on these climate books. Next month's is Veins of the Ocean by Patricia Engel, and I posted that above, and it's gone away, but I'll have my colleague will post it. Hopefully, Binyam, if you could post that, that would be great. But thank you to Orion Magazine. Thank you so much to Writers Rebel and all of the Writers Rebel New York City folks who are here, including Elliot Pachaya, Carrie, who did the reading guide, but most importantly to our audience and to our panelists, and for your insights, Kathleen, Leah, and Jessica. I could listen to you all for many hours more and look forward to seeing what you write and what more you have to say on this. And I hope our audience will continue to follow you on social and on the internet and Orion. I know Kathleen, you've written recently for Orion and continue to do so. And thanks to Amy for helping us to present this. I hope to see everyone who's here next month as well. And thanks again, Jessica, Leah, Kathleen, everyone. Please have a great night and thanks for coming.
Thank you.